If you have questions, feel free to interrupt. You don't need to save them to the end. I left plenty of room for questions. I think the talk's like 22, 23 minutes, something like that. And we're going to talk about taking a strategic approach to assessing viability for open source projects. A quick thank you to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. They fund the Chaos Data Science Initiative, along with the Linux Foundation and Ford Foundation, who also provide support for the project. I'll start by telling you just a little bit about me. I've been in the technology industry for well over 20 years, working mostly on open source projects from companies like Puppet, Intel, and more recently VMware. I'm currently working on data science for the Chaos project, where I'm also a governing board member and maintainer. I'm a board member of Open UK. We have a booth upstairs. And I'm co-chair of the CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group. And I have a PhD where I spent a few years researching how people collaborate within the Linux kernel, which was loads of fun. And I spent a lot of time thinking about open source project sustainability and viability. The obligatory XKCD appearance. Evaluating project viability and the risk that comes with it is really important because it can disrupt your business. It's also important to think about viability and risk as being on a continuum. Like with most things in life, there are no sure bets, and no project or technology, open source or otherwise, is completely without risk. There are only projects that are more or less viable across a wide variety of categories. And whether you should embrace the project and accept the risk that comes with it is a business decision and a strategic decision that should take how you're actually using the project into account. Looking at the viability of projects, especially ones that have the potential to impact your business, is a good first step toward managing risk and reducing the chances of potential disruptions. It's particularly important to look at the viability of open source projects that are critical for your ability to deliver products to your customers. This could include products that are built on top of an open source technology, or where those open source projects are integrated into your products or infrastructure. If you couldn't easily swap out that technology with a drop-in replacement of something very similar, you really should be assessing the viability of that project and understanding any risks that come with using it. So this talk will compare projects under neutral foundations versus those controlled by companies, kind of along the lines of what Gab was talking about in his keynote earlier. And it'll look at how people, the people leading and contributing to the project can influence viability. The presentation will contain details about how to assess project viability across 4 broad areas: governance, community, compliance and security, and strategy, which all impact the stability and overall viability of a project. So throughout these 4 areas, there will be discussions about techniques for measurement and which collections of metrics can be used for your evaluations. I wanted to start by talking about why it's important to think about who owns or controls an open source project, because it's something that many of us really just don't spend as much time thinking about as we should. The project's governance documents can usually help you learn more about ownership and control of a project. And from a risk perspective and a strategic perspective, you should be looking for projects with neutral governance, where decisions are made by people from a wide variety of companies. Projects that are controlled by foundations and ones that are owned by an individual company can have very different dynamics and different risks associated with using and contributing to those projects. Projects that don't have neutral governance are more likely to experience things like hostile forks or licensing changes that impact your ability to actually use the software. One way we can mitigate some types of risk is by supporting projects that are under neutral foundations whenever possible. So the CNCF, the Linux Foundation, Eclipse, Apache Software Foundations, those are all great neutral foundations. However, it's not always clear whether a foundation is neutral or not. Anyone can spin up a nonprofit or a foundation. If the board of directors or other leadership bodies tend to be made up of people who work at a wide range of companies, especially if they're competing companies, that's a really good indication that it's a neutral foundation. On the other hand, if the board members are primarily made up of people from a single company or maybe a couple of companies with very close ties, then it's not likely to be a neutral foundation. It can also help to look at the projects under that foundation. Were they originated at a single company, or did they come from a wide variety of companies? Do these projects have leaders from a variety of companies or maintainers from a variety of companies? And so the more you see references to a single company or one or two companies across the projects, the less likely it is to be neutral. One of the reasons that Kubernetes has been so successful is because Google contributed it to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. Putting Kubernetes into a neutral foundation provided a level playing field, right, where people from a whole bunch of different companies could work together as equals to create something that benefits all of us and the entire ecosystem. Open source projects, on the other hand, that are controlled by a single company are higher risk, and they can be less viable over the longer term because they operate at the whims of that company. And there's very little recourse for outside contributors or users when that company decides to go in a direction that may or may not align with the expectations of the other participants within that community. So for company-originated projects, consider the reputation of that company as a steward of open source projects. But always keep in mind that they can change their strategy at a later date. I'm not saying you shouldn't use or contribute to open source projects that are owned by companies. In a lot of cases, it totally makes sense. But you should think about the risks you're taking and whether that project is likely to be viable over the long term. And you should at least try to make sure that you understand the risks you're taking and how those risks could impact your company and your strategies. So along with the ownership of a project, there are quite a few different areas that you should look at as part of a viability assessment for a project, including governance, community, security and compliance, and strategy. And as I mentioned earlier, this is particularly important if a project is critical to your ability to deliver products to your customers and could not be easily substituted by a similar technology that you could use as a drop-in replacement. Within the CHAOS project, we have a relatively new concept called metrics models. So the CHAOS project, if you're not familiar with us, we do project health metrics. We're a Linux Foundation project, so an open source project. And we have these collections of metrics models, that are intended to be implemented together to understand a broader concept in more detail. Because measuring project viability is a pretty complex task. It didn't take us long to realize that putting all of those metrics into a single metrics model was just going to be too overwhelming for people. So these viability models were actually developed by Gary White from Verizon, who ended up breaking it into 4 metrics models, each focused on a particular viability topic. He also created a starter viability metrics model with a subset of these metrics designed to help people get started. So that's the first link on this slide. And that also has links to all of the 4 detailed models as well. So it's a good jumping off point for viability. So in this talk, I'll talk about each of those viability models. And then throughout the rest of the talk, I will discuss them in more detail, followed by a discussion about how metrics in the related models can be used to measure each area. So the second link at the bottom of the slide is to a 3-part blog post series that Gary wrote to help people understand the models and how to use them. So I encourage you to have a look at those blog posts as well. Governance can be found in all open source projects in one form or another, and it helps to outline the expectations around roles and responsibilities along with the decision-making process. But it will vary quite a bit depending on the size of the project. Knowing how collaboration occurs and how decisions are made is vital to building a sustainable open source project, because it means that people are able to make contributions that are more likely to be accepted. And if the processes for collaboration, leadership, and decision-making are not clearly documented as part of the project governance, This increases the risk of participating in or using the project because it introduces a lot of uncertainty into the mix. Leadership is another critical piece of governance. There might be committees, working groups, special interest groups, or other groups who help lead various areas of the project. At a minimum, there should be some kind of documentation about leadership within the project, including how those leaders are selected and who they are, even if it's just a list of a couple of maintainers. And ideally, there should be a fair and transparent process for selecting leaders, with leadership seats held by individuals with the right expertise and enough time available to lead the project. As mentioned earlier, we do have a viability metrics model that's designed to look at several areas to see if the project is well governed and that the maintainers and other project leaders are taking good care of the project. So these metrics look at things like issue inclusivity, which looks at whether issues are well labeled to make it easier for people to find something to work on. Responsiveness metrics like time to close, change request closure ratio, and issue age determine if the maintainers are keeping up with contributions and responding to them in a timely manner. Lib years and release frequency indicate whether maintainers are keeping their dependencies up to date, which is really important, and making sure that updates and fixes land in a release in a timely fashion. But in addition to the metrics, it's always a good idea to have someone read through the governance documents to look for any red flags, especially for projects that are critical to your products. A few common red flags include a lack of a process for removing leaders or maintainers who might not be acting in the best interest of the project, leadership seats, especially maintainer seats, allocated to organizations instead of individuals, and unclear processes for selecting leadership are just a few of the red flags to look for. The community is another critical part of assessing the viability of an open source project. Is the community active and engaged in productive discussions around the project? Are they helpful when people have questions or problems? Are they welcoming for new contributors and new users? Do they treat each other with kindness and respect? You want to look carefully at how people treat each other in discussions, code reviews, Slack, other communication channels. Projects with a culture of treating each other with respect and kindness are going to be more viable because people will want to continue to contribute. On the other hand, projects with toxic cultures put community members at risk. There could be real health risks, both mental and physical. And these toxic environments can actually impact retention for your employees, because they might be so eager to leave that project that they'll look for another employer where they won't have to work in that toxic community. And if the culture is too toxic, there's a real chance that the project could stagnate, or maybe even just cease to exist if too many people leave, which can result in a project that becomes unviable. And while there are general community metrics that can indicate whether a community is healthy, it's still a good idea to go beyond those metrics and have someone look at the community communication channels as they think about some of these questions. There are so many abandoned open source projects just sprinkled across the internet, and there's no single reason the projects are abandoned, right? Technologies evolve, people change priorities. Maybe the community loses interest. One thing that can reduce the risk of embracing an open source project is if the project is adopted by a whole bunch of other companies, since active projects with loads of users are less likely to be abandoned. And having a strong user base reduces the risk that the project might be abandoned. If you're actively using an open source project, it is likely that you'll find bugs or want to contribute some fixes back upstream or some features. So for projects you're using, you want to make sure that maintainers and other contributors respond in a timely fashion. Seeing large numbers of issues and especially large numbers of open pull requests or merge requests on a project is a red flag for me, because it can indicate that either they don't have enough contributors to handle the incoming contributions, or even worse, that they don't actually care about or want contributions from other companies, which is something you do actually see in some company-owned open source projects. Open source projects that are designed to keep diversity, equity, and inclusion top of mind will also be more likely to continue to be viable over the long term. Having a code of conduct, providing an environment where everyone, including people from marginalized populations, feels safe and welcome is another important indicator of viability. You should also look at whether the project has a diverse set of people at every level within the project, but especially in leadership positions. Projects that make a concerted effort to bring in new people from a variety of backgrounds and then have programs in place to help them move into leadership positions are more likely to be viable, benefit from increased innovation, and have a healthier overall community. Now, diversity and inclusion can also be difficult to measure, and it often involves more of a manual assessment or other techniques like surveys, for example. So this isn't included directly in the metrics model that I'm going to talk about next, but we've defined some metrics within the CHAOSS's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Working Group that you can look at for ideas about measuring various aspects of a project's diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, you'll notice some of the metrics do appear in multiple models. For example, change request closure ratio is a responsiveness metric that isn't just related to governance and maintainers, which is where you saw it earlier, but also relates strongly to the viability of the community as a whole, as I talked about earlier. Metrics like clones, forks, and project popularity don't really tell you much about the health of the project, but they can indicate that there's an interest in using and contributing to the project. And projects, again, with good adoption and an active community can be an indicator of viability, especially if those metrics are growing over time. Types of contributions is also important for viability. Change requests and committers are a good start, but you should also look at a wide range of contributions happening beyond just code. Things that are important for any project: documentation, community, accessibility, design, and lots of other roles can show that you have a well-rounded group of people working on all aspects of the project, which again improves viability. People often worry about security for open source projects with the premise that, if everyone can see the code, they might also be able to find and exploit security vulnerabilities. But the flip side is that there are also more people who can view the source code with the purpose of fixing those security vulnerabilities. So this doesn't mean that open source projects are automatically secure, but it does mean that it is something that I look for when I'm assessing the viability of open source projects, like whether they make regular releases and quickly patch security vulnerabilities. You should also look at a project's security policy documents to make sure that they have a solid process for allowing anyone to privately report security vulnerabilities and a way for dealing with those reports quickly and efficiently. They should also have an embargo process for privately notifying the companies who use their projects in their products to give these companies time to apply the security fixes before that vulnerability is made public. And this can't be easily automated using metrics, unfortunately, but it's worth a manual look for those projects that are most important for you. From a strategic standpoint, having time to update your products in advance of the public knowing about a vulnerability is really critical. And in short, projects that take a proactive approach to addressing security issues and releasing fixes are likely to be more viable over the long term. One good way to evaluate the security of an open source project is with the OpenSSF scorecard, which contains a wealth of information about the security of a project beyond just that top-line score. Defect resolution duration, lib years, and dependency measures are also important because projects that are slow to fix vulnerabilities and update dependencies will be less secure, which makes them a less viable solution because you don't want to ship your products to customers if they contain open source projects that have crappy security. Licensing compliance is also critical, so it's important to look very closely at the licenses used in an open source project. This is one aspect of viability that really can make or break whether you can use an open source project or include it within your product, depending on the policies in your organization. We don't always spend enough time thinking about contributor sustainability for open source projects. For any open source projects we rely on, are there enough contributors that if one of them retired on a beach tomorrow with zero notice, could the project continue with minimal disruptions? You should also look at organizational diversity as part of the health and risk for open source projects. If all or most of the contributions are from the employees at a single company, what happens when that company has a shift in strategy, or gets acquired, or runs out of money and just goes completely out of business? All of these things happen, right? Would the project be able to continue if the company pulled all of its employees out of the project? These single vendor open source projects, even ones that sit in foundations but where most of the contributors come from a single organization, might not seem risky at first glance, but they can quickly become unviable after a licensing change or when everyone just stops working on that project. Contributor absence factor, which is also sometimes called the bus factor or the lottery factor, looks at contributor sustainability and whether a project is likely to continue if one or more people left the project. Elephant factor is a similar metric, but for organizations, and used along with organizational influence can give you a sense for how many organizations are involved in the project. And if these numbers are high, with many people contributing, good organizational diversity, the project is going to be likely to be more viable over the long term. But if most of the contributions are made by a single person or people from a single company, you really might want to think twice about whether this project is a viable solution for your organization. Programming language sounds a bit strange, but it can also be a concern, especially for smaller organizations. If your employees are mostly familiar with Python, then a project written in Java might be really difficult for them to manage and contribute to if they find a bug. So in this case, projects and languages that your employees know reasonably well might be more viable for you to use. Most business decisions, not just open source decisions, but business decisions in general, boil down to an assessment of risk and making trade-offs. We should all be thinking strategically about project risks in light of how we're using these projects within our business. If we build products on top of an open source technology, we want it to be as low of a risk as possible. On the other hand, if we're using an open source project in some small part of a piece of non-critical infrastructure, we can accept a lot more risk for that project. And throughout this presentation, I talked about how to assess viability and how it often comes down to thinking about it from a perspective of risk and which risks you should accept. But it's also really important to think about which risks you might be able to mitigate. The best way to mitigate a lot of these risks is by paying some of your employees to contribute to these projects. This gives you an opportunity to help out in various ways to make the project better overall, but it also gives you more insight into where the project is heading and how things are going. So that if something changes within the project that increases risk in the future, you're more likely to at least know about it ahead of time. Before I wrap up this talk, I'll leave you with a few resources you might find useful. The CHAOS project has tools, metrics models for measuring all aspects of open source health and project viability. Anyone is welcome to join us. You can find our meeting calendar and links to our Slack workspace from these links. I also wanted to briefly mention the newly released practitioner guides found at the bottom link on this slide. These guides are designed to help people who aren't data experts and maybe even aren't open source experts make improvements in the open source projects that they care about. So far, we have guides focused on improving responsiveness, contributor sustainability, and organizational participation. So let's wrap this up. The ease in adopting open source can lead to organizations using software without considering its long-term viability. It's super easy for a random developer to just pull something in and stuff it into one of your projects or products. And not all open source projects are created equal. and some will be more viable than others over the long term. So the success or failure of open source projects that you use can have real business implications. What happens when the project changes its license, stops making security updates, or has other issues that impact your ability to use that software? When a project that's incorporated into your products or services later becomes unviable, it can have negative implications for your users, your customers, your overall business reputation. It's worth spending some time to critically assess whether a project is likely to be successful and continue to meet your needs over the long term. Open source project decisions have strategic implications that should be proactively evaluated to identify which risks can be mitigated. And ultimately, whether an open source project is viable for you boils down to balancing the risk versus reward for your particular use case. Project viability, like most things, and as I mentioned earlier, really does exist on a continuum. We should think about project viability and make informed decisions about which projects to use. Understanding open source viability is an ongoing process and a process that needs to be monitored and decisions revisited as these projects evolve. With that, I will say thank you. I will let you know the slides are already uploaded to the schedule, so if you wanted to grab some of the links, they're all there. With that, we have time for a few questions, or maybe one question. Yes?
Hi, so de-risking, firstly, this is really great. I was worried this is the sort of thing I'm going to have to do myself if I haven't got something here. It's so important. But I started looking at the technical side of de-risking as well. And I'm not suggesting this is the way forward, but there's things like microprofile, which is used as an abstraction layer for some of the major frameworks. Spring is a problem right now, and microprofile is intended, whether it is or not, as a way of removing that solid lock-in with something like Quarkus or Micronaut framework. So is there any ability to assess how much you're locked into a product and therefore take the risk of these things more higher? And a second sort of related question, do you backtest any of this stuff for some of the poster charts for problems in this space? Would your metrics have spotted some of the issues? I wouldn't want to mention the problems that we've seen, but there are some examples of where probably should have invested in that open source software.
Yeah, that is an excellent question. We actually, so I run the data science working group within the Chaos project, and we're starting to look at some projects and we're starting to look at some data sets and look at running some of these kind of as data science projects for people to try to see if maybe we could have predicted some of these events. We have somebody who's looking at Project Exodus. We're also starting to look at license changes. Part of the problem is like license changes is, from a statistics perspective, is such a rare event. There just aren't that many of them that it's really hard to analyze and predict. But we're gonna look at it and see if there's anything that we can do to predict some of it. So it is something that we're looking at. And then getting back to your first question, it's something. The problem is a lot of companies have internal infrastructure where they handle things like compliance. There are different tools. There are different ways of assessing what's actually in their products and what frameworks they rely on most heavily. So what we're finding is a lot of people use some of the Chaos tooling, for example, and build it, like hook it into some of their internal processes so that they can maybe start to assess some of these viability metrics and do it in a way that's integrated with their existing processes. Because the worst thing you want to do, like you've got all these probably existing compliance processes, you've got existing tools that look at what's already in your products, and then you certainly don't necessarily need another tool that the developers are expected to go look at. So a lot of people are starting to build this into their other infrastructure as opposed to doing it as something separate. Yeah.
Do you have any guidance or prior art for like surveying groups of users to understand like the aggregate business value that the software has contributed to these organizations? Because presumably certain organizations may use the software, but it's like in a cost center, others will be really getting a lot of value out of it. Do you have a metric on that before?
No, we don't really, because it's something that's a little bit hard to just programmatically determine, right? So when I was at VMware, we had some whole product lines that were built on top of Kubernetes and other cloud native technology. So that was super important because we couldn't build those products without it. But how do you differentiate that from, some other libraries that you could easily replace with something else that you don't care about as much? It gets a little bit hard to do that in an automated fashion. So I think it's something that, and this is something we chat about a lot when it comes to viability, is how much of it is a strategic assessment, how much of it is which things are absolutely business critical for us that we need to pay a lot of attention to, put people in these projects, contribute to, versus how do we do this at scale? And how do we automate some of these pieces so that you can look at all of the stuff that you're including and get some kind of a risk score. And that's something that Gary White at Verizon has been working on a lot. So he's the one that developed these models, and he's working on prototyping some of this at Verizon. But the challenge is he's integrating it into his existing tool sets, right? So it's not something that he can necessarily just open source and share with the world, because he's using some chaos tools, he's using Augur, and he's mapping it back to all of the internal tooling that they already have. So it's something that ends up, unfortunately, being very much of a DIY thing at a lot of companies. Other questions? You had a question? Yeah.
Do you use these metrics to then provide some recommendations to open source projects in how they can, improve their viability? Do you work with them, or how does that work?
We don't do that directly within the Chaos project itself, because every project is a little different, and you really need to be within that project to understand what improvements to make. However, these practitioner guides are actually designed to do that. So what they do is they say, here are 3 or 4 metrics that are a good place to start if you want to assess one of the areas that we've written the practitioner guides about. And then what do you do with it? So the biggest section in all of these guides is how to make improvements. And they reason through things like, are you looking at a temporary fluctuation because your whole team was at KubeCon, for example, and nothing got done that week? Or is this a real problem? Is responsiveness going down on a more permanent level? And it walks people through how to think about the things that are going on within their project and how to think about what improvements they might want to make. And it talks about, talking to the maintainers and working within the community to decide what improvements need to be made. Because in some cases, I can go to a company and recommend that they get lots of other people contributing to their project. If they don't actually want those contributions or care about that, I can make those recommendations all day. But until you actually talk to the maintainers and find out what they care about and what's important to them and what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve with the project, then you can have a much better discussion around what improvements to make based on the metrics or the data that you're seeing. Okay, thanks everybody. I think we're out of time. We're actually a little over time, so I'm cutting into your lunch. Sorry. But thanks everybody for coming.